And we are live. Good afternoon, alienated parents, alienated grandparents, alienated children, professionals out there, doctors, lawyers, therapists, teachers, clergymen, anyone out there that has information or any solutions to parental alienation and how we could save our children, please tune in today and comment in the comment box. Today, we have our special guest. Um, uh, from Chicago. We have Jay Rosenthal. Um, he is a child welfare consultant and former CPS investigator. He has more than 10 years of experience in social services across the for-profit, nonprofit, and civil service sector. In 2022, he left CPS to launch CPS Protect Consulting Services, a first of its kind consulting firm helping families across the United States prepare for and navigate child protection services cases successfully. I hope, after this program that you can somehow tie into Canada and maybe UK because we share this podcast worldwide. So any information that you give to the viewers for the United States, I'm hoping that Canada can follow because this is such a serious issue. Welcome, Jay Rosenthal, to Let's Talk Real Talk with Andy Martins from the Andy Martin Show and myself, Marielle Kovacs. I'm going to give Andy the floor for a minute, and we will ask you to tell us how you got. Well, I did say a few things, but you can get more elaborate on how, and when you started all this. So, Andy, welcome.
All right. All right. We're here. We're like glue, Mary and I. We always stick together, and whether it's my show or Mary's show. So, welcome, Jay, from the Windy City. Actually, I'm closer to you than Mary is. I'm in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, at the tip of Michigan. I'm about 6 hours from Chicago, straight down Michigan, and at the bottom of Lake Michigan. So I'm in the middle of Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior. But Jay, how did we get here? I grew up probably in a bubble. I mean, my family was somewhat dysfunctional. I was 13 when my parents divorced, but since I've been doing these shows in support of Mary, because I'm not an alienated father, um, CPS and all of this is crazy. And we've gotten to know since in the last 3, 4 years that there are people that are different. I can profile a narcissist now because my next door neighbor is one, and my workplace there was one. That's a terrible situation you are dealing with. How did you get there to doing what you're doing now?
That is such an interesting question.
I always ask the
Fir-
best questions on Mary's show, you know. Go ahead.
Why we
uh,
love you,
fir-
Andy.
Yes.
First and foremost, I'm not from Chicago, but I am
Oh,
from a city with a similar crime rate, so you did get that right. Um,
Oh,
I'm actually in Brooklyn, in New York City.
oh,
Uh,
Brooklyn. Yeah,
so
a lot of interesting things going on in New York City right now.
um, that's one way of putting it. Yes. Um, but more specifically to your question,
Right.
um, I had majored in psychology, and due to my own health, as a kid, I pulled the genetic short straw, so to speak, um, and I didn't end up going for my doctorate, and so I ended up in social services doing milieu therapy and uh, case management for a little bit. And I remember back in 2017, I had a seizure and I hit the floor. I was at work. My head hit it pretty hard. And due to one of my conditions, I mean, I've been dealing with it for years. So it wasn't a big deal to me. It was a shock to everyone else around me. And I was brought to the hospital. and I discharged myself against medical advice because I felt fine. I had another seizure, big deal. And
Right.
I did the dumbest thing I could have done, which was I hopped right back on the E train and went straight back to my office, where my supervisor was shocked to see me and asked what I was doing there. And I said I was there to finish my workday. One of the biggest mistakes I ever made. She did not let me stay. I started heading back to my apartment, and my head started to hurt pretty severely, like nothing I had ever felt.
Wow.
My father, who worked in Manhattan at the time, I called him and said, I can't make it back to my place alone. So I went back upstate to his place, my childhood home, that's where we were heading. I met him in Manhattan to go home, and I didn't make it back upstate. I ended up in another hospital screaming. And it turned out when the doctor said the words acute subdural hematoma, I pretty much knew the chances I was walking out were not particularly high. There was a mortality rate of about 50 to 90%. And by some miracle, I actually survived. Now, I learned a hell of a lot from that experience, what was important in life. When you really do escape what really could be death's door, you do learn what's important. And I searched for my calling, and I took the civil service exam, and a couple of years later, I was working for ACS in New York City, the Child Protective Services equivalent. And truly, I loved what I did. I did not love where I worked because, unfortunately, CPS is really no different than the IRS or the DMV. It's the same culture. If you've ever been audited by the IRS, if you've ever tried to renew your license at the DMV, the cliches about being in the wrong line, or you got to fill out this form, or you got to do that form, or they're cranky, or it's your fault that they got a number wrong and you got a ticket that wasn't for you. It's always somebody else's problem, and nothing ever gets done. The only real difference is the subject matter. And so it becomes very difficult to actually do the right thing in a very segregated, pass the buck, contempt style culture.
Right.
Child Protective Services, as far as the virtue, the ideal goes, yes, we should want to protect children. As for the execution, it is extraordinarily poor. And so I remember it was the first case that I ever took to court. It was a domestic violence case. Mom and dad were split. Mom was seeing this guy whose rap sheet was longer than I am tall. Now, I may only be 5'7", but that's still a pretty long rap sheet. And he was basically beating mom in front of the kid. And it was logic dictates it was only a matter of time before this girl was going to piss him off too. And it was very dangerous. Potentially. I mean, it's possible that he might never have touched the daughter, but you never know what happens. And it really is a frightening thought to think
Well,
about.
Jay, you're a CPS specialist. This is a choice that people make. It's the good or the bad. It's like a light switch. You make that choice every day. It's not like they wake up and say, I'm going to hit my spouse.
Exactly. But the point is, when we intervened, and because it was my job, it was what I was required to do based on the framework we had, which is simplified to treat everybody the same. But unfortunately, that also means that a lot of the nuances that apply to being a parent, that apply to families, they are often not factored in, because in order to factor those in, you couldn't treat every case and every family the same. and that's a very difficult trade-off to make. But I had, obviously the conditions that we had set, separate, which we would do for any case. You want to separate the abuser, or the potential abuser, and you would want to get some, get the parents some counseling, like domestic violence counseling. And I'm combining a couple of cases here. I'm trying to keep confidentiality. But I remember that I was asked, why I hadn't referred to a prevention service, and I referred to what we call the CBO, or community-based organization.
Right.
And I was lectured about this, and I'm like, domestic violence counseling looks like a good potential solution. Who cares where it's coming from?
Mhm.
And it was too little too late. I'd already done what I'd done. So, and it wasn't a bad thing that I'd done, but I felt bad based on the lecture I'd received. So the question was, why? And it took me a while to learn that. And this is where the Family First Prevention Services Act is a big issue. But that was really the first sign for me that something was a little off, because I looked at the quality of the service that, that I connected, that I would have connected the parent with, and it wasn't bad. So why is it wrong to solve the problem? Or why did I do it wrong? And the answer was, I think, my supervisor, of course, was just doing what she was told. It's not clear that she actually knew that, that funding was important to sustain the budget and pay the unions and everything else. And it also allowed for closer surveillance to make sure that things were essentially going well as CPS defines it. And this leads us into really one of the biggest mistakes that parents make, and also one of the gravest, is the assumption of, I'm a good parent and I have a good home, or I think I'm a good parent and I think I have a good home. And therefore, I'm not at risk of a CPS case. And if it happens, I'll just explain it to them, because they define they'll see it the same way that I do. And as long as they do that, um, then I have nothing to fear. And that is always the mistake. Think about it when you are, for example, going to a doctor's appointment. Um, you know, let's say let's say I go into a clinic and I say I have a headache, and the neurologist says you're having a stroke. The immunologist might say I'm having, it's hay fever. The psychiatrist might say I'm anxious or I'm depressed. Um, the internist might say, I don't know, let's monitor it, let's see, there's not enough information. You, you, when you're looking for, when you're looking for something, you see it. And you see it in everything, because that is the lens through which you are looking. And this is one of the problems with the child abuse pediatricians, as well, is when you are looking for child abuse or child maltreatment, or however you want to put it, and there are multiple explanations. Certainly, all of those explanations are potentially plausible, and God forbid it's abuse. Do you want to miss that?
Right.
And so this is a really serious problem.
Andy, turn your mic down. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Eventually, for me, I got really frustrated with the bureaucracy, and and all the hoops I had to jump through just to try and do the right thing. And at the same time, really learning things that were even outside of my tiny corner of the child welfare system. Which, what I did, I was the investigator. I was the one who received the report from intake, did the investigation, made the determination. If there was a removal, then I passed it on to the foster care case manager, the contractor. or the court ordered supervision units, or or prevention services when I was done. So I was really the second link in the chain. From intake, it went to me, and I just did the initial investigation. But eventually, it came down to I had three options, because I honestly I love helping families and actually doing the right thing. Unfortunately, government makes it very hard to do that. And so it came down to three potential options for me. I could either make the best of a bad situation, leave my calling entirely, or create what I thought was needed. And so apparently, now this was not my exact thought, but this is the most extreme version of the thought, and I use it to basically emphasize how crazy this was, to begin with. As I had this idea of, hey, why don't I start a direct-to-consumer social enterprise in a first world country where my sole competitor is the US government? And you know what? Somehow I'm going to make it profitable, and I'm really going to disrupt things, and it's going to be great. Now, anybody in their right mind would say that's absolutely crazy. There's a psych ward at the local hospital. Why don't you check yourself in there until you can get your head straight? And to tell you the truth, it is kind of a fool's errand, in that regard. But in 2022,
Well, Jay, the thing is, again, Mary, I maintain that you need to dig down deep in a relationship. It doesn't need to get to these situations that Jay was describing. It's solved at home, but again, whether you're in the United States or in Canada, we can't seem to do that. These people that are together for whatever reason, whether Mary and I do this show, we talk every day. Doesn't matter
Mhm.
whether it's a relationship with that or in marriage or in whatnot. You have to have the ability to give and take and stuff. Am I wrong, Mary? This doesn't need to get to this level.
No, parents need to come together when it comes to the children. Now, that's in the best interest of the child. Not one parent pits the other parent over the other to cause conflict, to cause dissociative disorders into the child's mind, to brainwash them to think the other parent is dangerous after that parent has raised them with love, respect, daily for years, and then all of a sudden have them come ripped out of their arms for no reason. Parents have to
It,
lose their egos, moms and dads. You're there as a unit, not as an individual,
see
right?
this.
So,
See this is where I push back on no reason, because there's always a reason.
well, yes, there is.
Now whether or not the reason is agreed with, and whether it actually makes the situation better, is a completely different question. So let's say there's let let's say there's an allegation of lack of supervision or inadequate supervision. Okay, now that's fairly arbitrary, and not only does every state define that slightly differently, but even when they do, it's very arbitrary. But let's say the child is 8 years old, is 13 years old, but has a disability, and like autism, or and although they're high functioning, they might not have some of the life skills for their to deal with their younger sibling. And so CPS can look at this and they'll say, well, this was for an extended period of time. That's really high risk. What if the autistic child has a meltdown and then ends up hitting the other child? Now, yes, that's a what if, but that is a risk. And if that's the lens that they're looking through, and that's how they're defining it, then that is the rationale that they use in that regard. Now, what they do afterward, for example, if the child gets placed in foster care, or whatever the response is that ends up being disproportionate to the actual issue, and let's say that in itself is traumatic and everything else, well, that's entirely that's an the way CPS looks at it, that's an entirely separate issue from, is this a legitimate concern? And so you have two different conversations going on at the same time. You have one going on about what, uh, how narrowly should we define child maltreatment and and uh, impending, immediate or impending danger, serious harm, these kinds of terms. And if we define it too narrowly, how many children might die, and how much of that can we accept? Because this is an adversarial relationship. If you the less power that you give CPS, for better or for worse, the more power that you give parents, the less authority there is to remove somebody, one of those few percent that are really in a very serious situation. And how, so what the question becomes, what is the right balance? And unfortunately, government gets a lot more heat when they miss a case of abuse than when they can say they at least did something. Now, even if they ended up placing in the wrong foster home, at least I can say I did something. And so that gives that puts much more pressure on government to act quickly, because if they don't and something happens, there are a lot more consequences. And so you would have to be a lot more, in order to change that structure, you would have to be a lot more forgiving of every time CPS misses something and a child dies. Parents would have to, the social framework would have to change. You would not sue them for that. There would not be liability in either, in either direction. But we don't live in a society where that's going to work. On top of that, uh, uh, Andy, I imagine you have reached the age where kids these days drive you nuts. And by kids, I mean people in their 20s, 30s at
Well,
this point,
my
for the
kids
most
are,
part.
yeah, in their early
It,
30s. Well,
with the way the social framework has gone, I don't think it's just a generational thing anymore. You have, there is some credence to what you're saying. And uh, honestly, I don't feel like I was born in the 90s. I feel like I belong in the 60s, maybe the 50s at this point. I am an older soul than my chronological age would betray. Um, but the point here is that we have a very overzealous system. The attorneys, um, for these CPS agencies, a lot of the time, they, uh, uh, this is one thing that a lot of the cop and lawyer shows get right, is when an attorney is looking to get a job, their win count actually matters. And so so basically they're being paid to win their case. And so it becomes less about justice and it becomes more about winning your case. And so even if the major stuff has been addressed, you go after the more frivolous stuff, because that is the function of an attorney. And that's how your worth or your value is measured. And so even independent of CPS, that idea has deviated away from one that focuses more on justice. And that causes its own set of problems once you reach court. Now, for me personally, I've seen that the way that a lot of parents handle this, and especially because attorneys, because of how much it costs to, go to school, get your license, get the experience, and then on top of that, all the regulatory compliance costs are unbelievable. Um, you know, unless you've got, 10 grand for, 25 grand for retainers fees in between the couch cushions, you have a lot of problems. So CPS Protected Consulting Services was the idea of, all right, there needs to be somebody in these families' ear telling them how, basically holding their hand, navigating through the madness. And that's what we do. The idea of what we call urgent assist by CPS Protected Consulting Services was basically creating a life insurance for uh, for, uh, for CPS cases. where you have former CPS investigators who can be with you by phone, by video, interacting with CPS when they're in the home. You subscribe before for a lower annual or monthly fee. There are ways that specific steps that you can take to actually reduce the chances of CPS ever showing up at your home. And if it does happen, the idea is, why don't you avoid court altogether and have it closed in 60 days more often than not? And if it doesn't, save on a lot of the billable hours with your attorney. On top of that, a lot of the attorneys, they sit around until your next hearing, and then a little before, even the best paid attorneys, they're like, okay, let's go over what we're going to do. They're not filing motions in between these hearings, which can go there can be months. They're not going and doing things like being there for you every time a foster care case manager, every time the CPS investigator follows up. They're not doing all of these things, and that's also where we come in. And I think that is something that is sorely needed, especially because CPS exists in this quasi legal environment where there's been this battle for I would say about 3 decades now over whether how do you put it over whether CPS should be considered law enforcement or social service providers. And so far they are social service providers. But let's say uh, they go in, and they do a removal immediately based on a report, and they don't have a court order yet. Well, yes, they can actually do that. And the way that they do that is there's usually what we call it's an informal, sorry, not informal, but a non-binding agreement between CPS and law enforcement, what we call a memorandum of understanding. And
Right. But I don't think
Mhm.
CPS has a good grade in Canada anyway, Mary. Do you think I'm not seeing it. It's like people almost rely on CPS to do it all, but the onus still should be on the parents to make it happen.
I, 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 I- absolutely,
Oh,
but
let
well,
let Mary
okay,
answer that, and then we'll go back
sure,
to you, Jay.
sure.
What I see here in Canada, yes, CPS is like basically the first ones that the police will call to get there and have everything disrupted. It's
So
almost like
mhm.
having someone come into a crime scene and screw everything up. So this is what, CPS is doing to a lot of families before the police can get there to get the right story.
I am
So,
some I am somewhat familiar with CAS in Canada. They call it the Children's Aid Society,
yes.
and their local agencies. Thankfully, if you go back into the history of organized child welfare in the Western world, it basically originated in the United States with the Mary Ellen Wilson case in 1874. Um, and out of that came the first organized child protection agency, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which was actually founded by uh, those from um, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Henry Berg, the director, and his legal counsel, Elbridge Gerry. Um, the what grew out of that, and eventually, government's takeover, really in the 60s, when the family court was established in 74 with CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. And we, as these societies, the virtue of child protection started to wear off. It wasn't, not every county was covered, not every state was covered by these societies. Personnel, kind of, the volunteers just weren't doing it anymore, and government stepped in. I think one of the other major issues, especially in the United States, is a lot of the constitutional amendments that are often cited as being violated. Um, they do not really apply. And the reason is they are limited to criminal acts. And a lot of people don't make a distinction between what's illegal and what's criminal. All criminal acts are illegal, but not all illegal acts are criminal. And so the family court, for example, is not a criminal court. Um, and so, for example, the Fifth Amendment, yes, it still prevents you from incriminating yourself, but if it's not a criminal act specifically, then you don't have that robust protection from those illegal issues. And because people don't make that distinction and they think that criminal means illegal, and I've seen this a lot, um, it they end up saying, well, yes, it was illegal what they did. They violated my rights, and they end up getting laughed at. But it's not because they. It's because they misunderstood it, because this is so complicated. The child welfare system, at least in the United States, and from what I hear in Canada as well, it's basically like the tax code. If you really
Mhm.
understand it on a nationally, um, really, really well, you've probably wasted about half your life.
Can I jump in there for a second? So what
Sure.
you're saying is like, okay, I was falsely arrested. I had to go to criminal court, but the family court system still condemned me, even though I was proven innocent in criminal court.
Different standards. Now, I don't know the family court itself well enough in Canada to provide details on that. So I don't want to get that wrong. It may be similar to the U.S., but I don't want to say that um, I don't want to say that that I'm that confident without knowing for certain. But here,
But
a
would
lot of
that be
times,
the same,
uh,
like in the
uh,
United States?
so
Like false
in the
allegations?
So whether so it depends on how something is defined, how you if you define it as false, as not true, but they say that, well, from our vantage point, it is true. This is something I often tell families. You're playing, yes, you're playing a rigged game, uh, but uh, and but rigged games are still possible to win. You have to play your cards right. But if you decide that you're going to play by your rules and not by theirs, and you're being judged by their rules, that's like playing chess while playing by the rules of checkers. Guess what? You're probably going to lose because you're not playing
Wrong
by the
move.
rules that matter.
Wrong
And
moves.
so, yep, That, that's exactly it. So you may say that it was a false allegation, but how do they define a false allegation? And in the U.S., all reports to the child maltreatment hotlines are basically assumed to be in good faith, unless and you can't. CPS can never tell you who has made a report. That's always kept
Right.
confidential. So you have to be really confident that you know, have evidence, and file a police report and get the police to investigate, have enough evidence to get the district attorney to not stick that in the circular file and actually prosecute that and get a judge to get a court order to unseal the identity, and that assumes that the report wasn't made anonymously. So if you don't go through all of that and you aren't successful, it's not labeled a malicious report. And if somebody just believes that it's possible that someone is being abused, it doesn't matter. And then when CPS comes in, if they see some additional issue, because they're never just looking at just the allegations unless they're limited to that, they're looking at everything. Um, if what matters is how they define it. And so in the family court, most of the time, if they're looking to adjudicate, they're using the preponderance of the evidence standard. So there are a couple of ways to look at that. Uh, Either it's 50.01% likely that the allegation is true, or that it's more likely than not. But again, when you're using a combination of precedent, good and bad, and very ambiguous laws on the books, it really comes down to how it's interpreted. And that is why it is so important very early on, especially before it even gets to court, because most of the time it doesn't. Um, what you say, how you say it, and taking stock of all the information that they may have access to and preparing for multiple contingencies is so absolutely vital. Because if you're going against the credible evidence standard, you're going against the preponderance of the evidence standard, you're working within a you're working in within a relatively low threshold. And the difference between an unsubstantiated case closed in less than 60 days and one that goes to court and lasts 2 or 3 years isn't as big as people assume it is. It really isn't.
Wow, that's interesting. That's, so your cases, when you go into them, I know you can't speak about them, but you could give us an insight on how well you're successful in proving false allegations or getting the child back to the rightful parent.
So the I rarely when I did work for CPS, I rarely conducted a removal because for the most part, I found every reason that I didn't have to, and I also got lucky. Nothing backfired on me. Um, Now, what I do with CPS Protective Consulting Services, helping families prepare for and navigate Child Protective Services cases, um, with the subscribers that we have had that have stuck with us through it, we have been relatively successful. Sometimes it depends on at what stage they come to us. The earlier you come to us, the better an outcome we can get. Um, and if you assume that 6 months, that within 6 months of a removal, that you're going to get your kid back and CPS is going to be gone, unfortunately, it rarely moves even that quickly. A lot of it, that's why we tend to go after. We do accept some mid-stage cases and definitely early stage, but our ideal is to go after those who don't have any active CPS involvement, bolster them up, then God forbid it happens, uh, be with them every step of the way. Because otherwise, because there are such narrow windows for actually, for potential success, especially a quicker turnaround time. You have to be really swift and really on your toes from what you're doing on day one. The smallest mistake that you make at any age, at any stage, can prolong a case for up to 3 months.
Wow.
For 3 months, and that's 90 days more,
Hmm.
which is absolutely huge. In the United States, there was a 10-year longitudinal study that was published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2017. It found that more than 1 in 3 children will face a CPS case before they reach the age of 18. More than 1 in 3. The exact figure was 37.4%.
And why
Um,
is that?
that is because, well, a lot of it I attribute to the mandated reporter laws, which is there are so many things that could that could possibly look like child maltreatment, and if your professional license is at stake, if you don't, if you don't report it, then then you see a lot of people who will report every little thing, and that results in a huge amount of reports. On top of that, then you have some reports that are made in bad faith that are never held accountable. But there are about, I would say, 4.5 million reports made every year in the United States. 2.5 million are
Wow.
accepted for investigation on average, year over year. Um, so what ends up happening is, I although there's plenty of corruption, there's a lot less corruption than is actually actually talked up. It's that there are so many cases that even if 1% are corrupt, and when I say 1%, I'm coming up with an arbitrary number here, hypothetically, that still amounts to thousands of corrupt cases every year. So yes, you can find thousands of examples of corrupt cases, even if 99% still follow technically by the book based on the ambiguous laws and policies and all this other stuff. Um, so a lot of families, and I've had to learn this. One of the reasons it's so hard to get people who have not really had CPS involvement to actually see it this way, and understand it for what it is it is such a devastating thing to think about.
Mhm.
And most people don't actually want to hear it. Um, a a lot of this comes down to, can you imagine, before anything happened to you, looking over your shoulder, wondering if the next Karen is going to call CPS on you and you're going to lose your kids? That is a very negative, that is very fearful existence to live in, a very paranoid existence.
Yeah.
And most people want to believe that the world is better than it is. And so they will do these mental gymnastics or take stock in the fact that there is bliss in ignorance, um, i- because it is devastating to actually accept what might be true. Um, i- i- and this is essentially why I have taken this up. It wasn't just that it was my calling. I don't have kids yet myself. I want to be able to raise kids. I don't want to have to be looking over my shoulder like that with kids of
No,
my own. And so, yes, this has essentially become a hill that, well, I haven't died on it, but that I would be willing to die on, um, because it is truly that important an issue. And I think there's a heck of a lot of understanding. I think that a lot of victims have actually done a disservice to
mhm,
to the cause, because you see a lot of people whose parental rights have been terminated and they're desperate, still talking about it. Their case may not be it may not be packaged right for media consumption, and a lot of times they're not looking at the bigger picture because they're clouded by, I want my case resolved, and that's not always what the bigger picture would look at as being a potential long-term solution. There is no doubt that are going to be there's lots of irreversible damage that we're not going to be able to fix. But if we don't try to turn off the faucet sooner rather than later, it's
it
just
keeps
not going to work.
dripping.
And
Yeah.
that trauma and that lens that they're looking through makes it very, very hard, for a lot of them. There's some who have gone through it that make very good advocates and very good activists. And
Mm,
so it's not everybody, but I think that, um, when you're looking at an issue like this, while it's always important to have and this is more of a hot take, while it's very important to have the input of people who have gone through it and the feedback to make sure that you're sensitive to it, I think actually orchestrating it, you need people who don't have a vested stake in their own case or their own family in that regard. They need to be somewhat detached from it. Just because emotion is your enemy when when you need to look at the numbers. Look, it's the same reason I wouldn't face CPS alone myself, no matter how much I know, because I know that I'm going to be worried. Are they taking my children? I just want this to go away. I'm not going to be the same person that I am, uh, working with someone else, um, on their case, that I am going to be, uh, on my own case. I'm actually going to be worse for me. And that's not really, uh, a good thing. Certainly, this is a big issue, um, but we do need, and I've heard this cry, we need to build our own infrastructure outside of CPS. And that is the point. Um, they're not listening to the activists right now. And the reason is
no,
the activists aren't funding them. There are these nonprofit foundations like the NEEKC Foundation, Mathematica, among others, that are basically funding every commissioner. They've got to say in every appointment, every election, all. all of these. And so that's really the main driver of child welfare. So the only way to, the government is never going to actually pivot, especially because look, if you're going to fire a bunch of people because you're going to get rid of this and you're going to get rid of this, the unions are going to come after you too, and they have a lot of political power. So, and of course, everybody who's going to lose their job, well, then what? How are they going to feed their family, and how are they going to, house themselves and everything else? And so what needs to happen is the government essentially needs a scapegoat, and they need a scapegoat that they don't control, that they don't fund, that is able to disrupt the status quo. And the more subscriber, the reason we charge for our subscriptions really is, look, we could get a contract from the government, but then the government's going to tell us how we can and can't help families, and that's going to compromise how we can do it. And look, we could go and sell our subscribers data and charge less for it, but I tend not to believe in that. So we try to lower the cost as much as possible. There are some, nonprofits that offer to sue on behalf of some people, like the Family Preservation Foundation and the Parental Rights Foundation, and they do some great work. But the problem is the demand always vastly exceeds the supply, and so whenever you offer something for free like that, you basically help a lucky few, and you leave everybody else hung out to dry. And that's not a solution either, which is why my thought has always been we need to create these institutions that can be disruptive outside of the um, uh, outside of the government, that can disrupt the status quo, where the government can say, yeah, what we're doing right now isn't working, but we're doing everything you say. It's not our fault, it's them. And
Mhm.
so then that might result in the first meaningful conversation on what sensible child protection actually means, in the society we want to have. Um, but until then, it's very hard to actually do that because it is so entrenched.
Right. How qualified are these CPS workers in the States? Like, are they really qualified to take away a child? Have they been trained? Have they been through domestic violence programs, child abuse programs, or are they just coming off the street getting a job from 9 till 5? Because a lot of them are so wet behind the ears that they don't know whether they're, coming or going. I've seen
It, de-
so many CAS workers here that were just children themselves. How
it,
would they
dep-
know anything at all?
it depends on how you determine the qualification, but because there is so much bureaucratic redundancy, and because there is so much so many of these workflows are already narrowly defined, in terms of, for example, the safety and risk assessments that are used in the United States, because things are oversimplified. um, yes, it matters to a certain degree, uh, the interpretation, uh, but yes, they do go through training, and in various states, the training and credentials sometimes vary. But is a bachelor's degree today the great predictor that it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Uh, there's
Probably not.
evidence to suggest that it's not. So the question is, uh, how do you define that? And what is the actual problem? Is the problem the workers? Can you actually, is the problem the workers and the training they're receiving, or is it the ambiguity of the laws and the terms, and the inefficiency of the bureaucracy that is government, generally speaking? And so you could have multiple problems, but I think you have to prioritize it. Let's take a look at, for example, reasonable efforts. A lot of people think reasonable efforts means, well, what's reasonable to me that somebody would do to preserve or reunify a family? And the truth is that reasonable efforts is an extraordinarily low standard, and you may understand it in the form of contracts between businesses. The same concept applies here. Reasonable efforts is an extremely low standard. They basically have to try maybe a thing or two, maybe a safety plan if there's not an exception to the reasonable efforts requirement. And then, well, if that doesn't work and it's uncertain that the child would be safe, well, now we can justify that. And people are like, you didn't make reasonable efforts. Well, do you know what reasonable efforts means? And I've asked this online, and the responses that I tend to get is nobody seems to have an understanding of reasonable efforts. Now, I think Canada has an even bigger problem with this than the United States does. But diversity, equity, and inclusion has removed the merit-based, uh, the merit-based metric from hiring, and is focused so much on racial and sexual identities that I think that there have been consequences, not just in CPS but across the board, where we're not actually looking for the people who can do the job best. We're just looking for bodies. There's also a very high turnover, because what people don't realize is even if a child is being abused, let's say you have to do a removal, a child's legitimately being abused, beaten, and you have to do something. Okay. Um, that child is still going to feel safer with the enemy they know than the friend they don't.
Yes.
And so they're going to have the same reaction of I don't want to go, even if they are beaten to a pulp every night. They are still going to have that. And so whenever you go in, whatever you're doing, every CPS worker and is they are not prepared to handle what they call the vicarious trauma that comes
Right.
with it. There is a very narrow range of empathy that you have to have in order to be able to do this consistently and do it well.
Yes.
Because if you are too emotionally detached, you will never align enough with the family to get them to open up to you. And if you have too much, I if if you let your emotion get in too much and you empathize too much with the family, you will burst into tears and be at the first sound of their sob story, and you won't be able to do your investigation. So most people, I would say maybe 1% of the population can actually do this effectively and with integrity. Even if you know what you have to do, this is very difficult. I remember there was a time on my work phone, I was on vacation for a little bit, and I was out of the office, and I was actually getting hang up calls 12, 1, 2 in the morning for several days, and nobody was going to do anything about it. And I actually feared for my life. I worked in some of the highest crime neighborhoods in New York City,
Mm.
and um, that was always that was always an issue. My parents knew what I did, and I can only imagine the amount of heart attacks they had while I was out there on the streets completely unarmed. I mean, I
By
did have
yourself? You had no one with you?
well, we
Wouldn't
never had
wouldn't
well, we never had enough staff. We had so many reports, so
so
who
they
else was
never
going to be
paired
there
you
with
up?
me?
Well, I think
Occasionally,
today
occasionally, if I really needed a co-assist, I could have. I was not allowed to carry so much as pepper spray. I did
oh,
have a tether that would notify the cops if it was separated uh, from my phone, but all that would do is if something really happened, it would get there. They would get there just in time to collect my body, essentially.
so
Uh,
you were your life was on the line and you were always in jeopardy as well.
oh,
So
absolutely.
basically they didn't really care whether you were
Well, they would have
protected.
if I had died, they would have issued a press release and said we lost a great child protective specialist in the line of duty, and then they would have gone right on and replaced me. There is a
Yes.
very high turnover in CPS because the pay is not great for the frontline workers. They are often overworked. They have so many cases on their plate, they actually can't devote the time that they really uh, need to resolve the concerns uh, for each family. That certainly is a real issue. So I think you have a number of problems. You have the bureaucracy, you have the ill-defined terms, you have the idea this is adversarial, you have the growing definition, you have the broadening of what constitutes child maltreatment. You have a system that is very slow to react to problems in it, and you have a lot of confusion as to what you should do and when. Even in law enforcement, you see that there are a lot of cops who they understand their small corner of what they do, but they don't really have uh, an understanding of the laws anywhere near what the DA's office has.
Right.
And so that leads to its own set of problems. In that sense, CPS is no different. Um, so it, it is an extremely big problem. I think that there needs to, one of the questions nobody's asking is what role should the government play
Yes.
in child protection? And when it comes to my own prescription for this, usually history repeats itself. So if you look somewhere across the past 200 years, you'll see where you went too far and you'll find the happy medium. Unfortunately, eventually people will forget and we'll get back to this place again, assuming we exist long enough to do that. And I think that we will probably be around for at least another 200 years. Um, so I assume that even once we resolve this, we will end up in this place again. You see that with AI.
Turnover.
It's just another version of the Industrial Revolution. It's just another disruption. You see that, look, with October 7th, with what happened in Israel. Um, Look, we said never again with the Holocaust. Um, when people start going after the Jews again, that's when everybody else needs to start to sweat. That's usually a big red flag.
Hmm.
So history will repeat itself. And the Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, especially before the 1960s, what they would do, they were volunteers. It was a private 501c3 nonprofit. They would do the investigations. If they found enough evidence, they would bring it to the DA's office, and there would be a criminal prosecution, and you would get the protections to come with a criminal court, and there would be criminal charges. The family court did not really start dealing with CPS until the 1960s in the United States. And I say that because the U.S. was really the first to do this when it came to organized child protection in the Western world. Um, so in that sense, I think that you need to get back to the point of we need to recriminalize custodial abuse and neglect.
Yeah.
We need to actually, and I'm oversimplifying it. There are a lot more details here. We obviously need to narrow and tidy up the definitions that we use. We need to fix the social breakdown, of our respective cultures, both in the U.S. and in Canada, for example. And then the government should do what it does best, which is essentially get out of the front lines and and be the body that holds these societies accountable
Yes.
when they go awry. And I think that is where government is meant to be on this issue. They are not meant to be on the front lines managing everything up the chain. Because at some point they're the people who say let's abolish it, but they don't really have anything else that they can offer. And I don't think that in a society that you're going to get enough people who are going to say it's okay that we just basically ignore kids and we just trust the parents, and if something happens, it happens. I don't think that that is a solution that any society is ever going to be okay with. So you're going to have to work with some type of framework if you're going to get enough people to actually agree to that and come up with a long-term solution. Um, that's the way I see it. I don't know that what I am potentially proposing here would work. I'm not clairvoyant, but with CPS Protect Consulting Services in the short term, certainly, and this idea, this is the best I can come up with. And what I tend to say is, if you have a better idea that you think would work, then I'm happy to back you, but nobody else has come up with it. And when it comes to the how of the CPS problem, everybody seems to have an opinion on the who, what, where, when, and why. The only answer I've ever gotten from other people when it comes to the how, it goes something like this. if everybody would just do what I tell them to do, we would all live in peace and harmony. Now, tyranny technically is an answer. It's not an answer that I endorse, but I will give people credit for at least having those that come up with something. They did at least come up with something. Although I've heard Lenin use words to that effect. I've heard Mao use uh, words to that effect. I've never actually seen that work. And the reason is no matter how confident you think you are with your solution, there are always going to be factors and variables that you don't anticipate, that you don't take into account. And those consequences mean that whatever you come up with is likely to have its negatives too.
Right, right. We're past the hour here, Jay. How can people get a hold of you when they need your help?
So our website is cpsprotect.com. If you click register, we have a free tier, Urgent Assist Free, and that gives access to our extensive knowledge base, CPS knowledge, and actually a quarter of an Urgent Assist hour, which can be used for an Urgent Assist message to ask a question to one of our child welfare consultants. There's also a subscribe page with our paid subscriptions that come with more access, like things with Urgent Assist Call, Urgent Assist Video. We have an AI program that is trained on the laws in all 50 states, the federal laws, the policy manuals, recommendations from our child welfare consultants, among other things. And any subscription that we get supports us. It's never too early to start uh, working to prepare for a CPS case, and ideally preventing one from ever occurring. Um, but unfortunately, right now we only serve the United States. So if you don't live in the 50 states in DC, we don't reach you at this point. Look, when we do have the funding, there are plans long term to actually establish CPS Protect Consulting Services elsewhere, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, in places where we think that we can make it work. But because although the basics, at least in these countries, are set at a federal level, the small details really matter. And that what happens is if you're going to actually establish um, uh, something like this in other countries, you need local talent, you need a different understanding, and you need a localized set of tools, different from what we have here in the United States to make it specific enough. So
And
there
who
are
would be the
plans.
one to implement all this? To teach,
Well,
consult and all that. Would you be able to do all that with your welfare consulting, child welfare
so
consulting?
so we would that is quite a ways off because we have to actually really get ourselves on the footing where we actually have the funding to actually establish something in another country. Um, so I wouldn't get excited about this too quickly, unless, look, maybe someone else will start something similar in another country before we even get there.
Right,
I don't think that competition is ever a bad thing. I do enjoy the sport of business, and it certainly keeps businesses from trying to one up. It keeps businesses trying to one up one another and make things better. That's never a
right.
bad thing.
No. I have a comment here from Zach Zacklin. Instead of organized child protection, CPA, CAS are doing organized child abuse. Number of corrupt cases are way more than anyone can imagine. What's your
So,
comment on
uh,
that?
so it
Thank you,
seems
Zach.
like for the thank you for your comment. I think that uh, it sounds like Zach, you're from Canada because you're using the CAS
Yeah,
terminology. Um, I don't know the exact metrics in Canada, so I can't speak to it. You might be right for Canada, but in the United States, I would go back to what I said earlier, where there are so many cases. I think a lot of what is there is a decent amount of corruption. I don't think that it is as high as people say it is. I think with the sheer amount of cases and children involved, that even a small percentage ends up in thousands to tens of thousands of kids over time. Over 5 years, you could see, potentially tens of thousands of examples, uh, you know, in a sea of millions. But those tens of thousands of examples are certainly a lot. And you're at the point where you're using commas. You're at the point where you're 5 digits at least. So certainly that's a very sizable amount of damage. But when you're looking at this on a national scale, the question is always going to be, how do you define corruption? Because I think corruption has suffered from the same issues that terms like racist and bigot and narcissist have, where it almost becomes anyone that you disagree with or anyone that you don't like. And
Or
so I
say
think that you
no
really have
to.
to look at, yes, how corruption as a term is actually defined, because ignorance, although there's a point at which ignorance does become malice, and there's no exact line where that's drawn. Ignorance is a more common issue, and so I may be defining corruption more narrowly than you are. So it's not necessarily that there's a disagreement. It just depends on how you define corruption. What I would
Right.
say is probably what you define as corruption that I don't. That difference, I still agree, is morally bad, but legally it might still be correct, because legally correct does not mean the same as morally correct. Two
Right.
things can be true at once. Something you can legally be authorized to do it, but morally it doesn't mean that you are in the right to do so.
Right.
And so that's what I would say to that. Not that you're wrong, but I think that we really need to have a conversation about what corruption actually means. Because if I define it differently than you do, then we're having two very different conversations, and we could end up very quickly in an argument where, in effect, we don't actually disagree.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jay. I mean, this has been a very interesting hour. So I'm going to give you your last words here. What do you recommend, or what could you recommend to parents that are having attend CPA, attend the doors? Should they let them in? Should they not? How do they protect themselves?
We actually have a free guide on our website. I know it works in the United States. I don't know if it applies to Canada, because I don't know all of the exact rules in Canada, so I don't want to speak to that. But that's downloadable from our homepage. That's absolutely free. Usually, if it's a surprise, you don't want to be caught off guard. You want actually time to prepare. And so sometimes, if you just bring your kids to the door and you have them outside and they ask a few questions, now there's some cases where that might not apply, and you have them come back the next day, well, then maybe you can actually take a look at your home, make sure everything is up to snuff. You can take time to process exactly what has happened, get in touch with an attorney, get in touch with us, and make sure that you're ready for a full interview. That way you haven't revealed a whole lot, and you can make sure that you're not caught off guard. Ideally, what I would say is have an attorney on retainer, or if you're in the United States, subscribe to us before this actually happens. Let us bolster you up before anything actually occurs. I've never heard a parent say uh, anything other than, my kids are the most important things in the world to me.
Yes.
Now, if you'd insure your car, if you'd insure your health, why are you not concerned about this for your kids? are you that confident that are you that confident that CPS is never going to show up at your door?
Mm.
That you're not going to take the steps that you need to take today? I want to
Surprises
see.
happen all the time.
I I know that. I know that. I want to see. Parent. I want to see. I want to see parents. You know, mothers. You know, expectant mothers saying to each other, "Have you gotten your urgent assist subscription yet?" Because,
Mm.
or even if it's not CPS Protected Consulting Services, you absolutely need to be prepared for this. And it's truly amazing how little people actually know. And that's why, look, for urgent assist free with our knowledge base, some of your Canadian subscribers may find it helpful. I know there is one person from the UK who actually registered for urgent assist free and said that the articles he in our knowledge base, he found them helpful because there were a lot of similarities and it helped
Mhm.
him understand. That's at cpsprotect.com/register. If there are any, if you do have additional questions about the services that we do offer, our toll free number is 844-633-KIDS. We also receive emails at contact@cpsprotect.com. But certainly, um, the majority of what you can do to prepare yourselves is going to depend on where you are, the laws and policies applicable to you, any medical or mental health conditions in the family, the type of home that you have, the community that you live in, the social supports that you have, the relationships that you have, any prior potential criminal history, parking tickets, domestic violence, where your child goes to school, how you school them, um, who their friends are. There are so many variables that come
Yes,
into play that can change someone's risk profile, and needs, that I'm reticent to give very general, broad spectrum recommendations, just because when you do, if you're treating everybody the same and not every case is the same, you end up giving somebody the wrong advice. I see this a lot on social media where somebody will say in one state or one province, they'll say, well, this worked for me, but they had different, there might not have been the same allegations, there might not have been
yes,
the same circumstances, and the rules might apply differently across provinces or across states. And so what's good in one state or province and what's good for one allegation or one family is it could be detrimental for another. And
that's
if
right.
you're not, and a lot of people end up taking this advice like gospel, and all of a sudden they end up in a whole lot of trouble.
Exactly. Exactly. Every case is different. Well, thank you so much for coming on to Let's Talk Real Talk,
It's
Jay.
been my
This
pleasure.
has been very informative. We'll have you back for another part two because you've got so much information out there that you cannot consume it into just 1 hour. So we are so grateful for everything that you've given us. Education is extremely important today. We all need to know what we're getting into, first of all, when we get married, and then when we have children, because nothing is going to last forever. A marriage will break down. Children um, in a marriage, it suffers the most if it's not amicable, or one parent doesn't get help over the other parent, because a lot of people don't believe in therapy. uh, Therapy is good. Therapy is good. I know that. I've been there. It helped me,
I
brought me
will
this
say,
far.
I will say it's good for the right people, but Abigail Schreier's recent book, Bad Therapy, has
Yes,
definitely been an interesting read. Anything that can be good for you can also be bad for you.
that's right.
So it's always important to look at what is best for you in your unique situation.
That's right. And that's why I would say that if therapy's not working, find some other group support, support groups or doctors out there that can help you, because there is help for everybody out there. It's just the way you perceive the help and how you accept someone else's um, telling you what to do. Not really telling you what to do, but giving you guidance, leading you into a better direction to protect yourself, your children, your marriage, your home, your assets, because everything is combined when you lose a child. You're not just losing your child, you're losing your life. And that's the hardest part. So thank you for joining us, alienated parents, grandparents, alienated children. My last thoughts and words are never give up on each other. Keep the love open. Communication is extremely important, because shutting out a family member because someone told you something that you didn't like is wrong. You know, social media platforms are blocked. Children have no contact with a parent because the other parent's over the shoulder. There's so many scenarios out there, but all I can say is let the children love the other parent, because, you know, you both made them. So anyways, so next Tuesday we have Theodore Chino coming on at 1 p.m. and it's important for us to have both male and female come on the show. So anybody out there that would like to come and share their thoughts or whatever, you can contact me or Andy Martins and we'll book you on to Let's Talk Real Talk. So thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone out there. We'll see you next week. Good day.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.